Hello, before we get started into this, just a reminder that this is very much my opinion and how I experienced things through the Groove of Wars through 4 through 7 and 8. Yeah, 8 too. and also, every meta is quite nuanced in Wargroove because obviously, like, the meta is different for every map. But I think there was still, at least in the Groove of Wars I saw, there was a general sense of what the meta was. That was basically not like a very hard line, but a general trend that you tended to see on every maps except for outliers. And before I joined, it was basically the Spear era, 1.3. I wasn't there for long. I joined a little before 2.0, but you can tell, I think a lot of people can tell the meta was pretty much always make a bunch of spears and then because trebs were still like soft available back then, your end game was kind of always treb and then like get a balloon to get it out or like use Nuru or Tenri to get it out, something like that. Groove was also less available because commanders didn't one-shot stuff. They just didn't, so Groove was harder to farm. And I think that's my impression of the 1.3 meta. But then again, I wasn't really there, so that's probably the least accurate of them all that I have. Groove of War 4 arrived with 2.0, and it was, looking back, it was a bit chaotic. But basically, there was a lot of new changes to the game, and Groove of War 4 arrived in the middle of all this with some new maps, basically new units because Spears got a price nerf, and now you had to build other stuff. And it was a lot of fun, but also people realized pretty fast that golems were the answer. Golems, you just build golems and then have golems run over the map everywhere and just kind of smash everything. But golem and mage is like impossible to fight into without your own golem and mage. And at the time, there was this like map trend to have some mountains in the middle to make it hard to cross the center. But what that made is that golems can now camp the center and be on a mountain at the same time, and basically you can never get them out. The maps also had some very safe HQs at the time, so you needed like a lot of army power to actually reach the HQ. And when golems kind of do that, golems, once they're in your army with mages, they can push, they can have a sustained push, and they can go very far unless your opponent like commits a lot to defense, which is still possible and still happened on a 30-minute timer, But golems were pretty much the go-to. Also, the maps were fairly higher econ than what we have today. Maps were often 1300 or 1400 econ per player on like if the map is split evenly, and that makes it fairly easy to just spam a golem every turn once you have a few mages out. So yeah, basically Groove of War 4, golems everywhere. There was also like some very strong COs, and that also I think contributes to golems because with the low timer and like the explosive grooves, like you have the Ragnas, you have the Caesars. The one thing that just doesn't get blown up by every groove instantly is pretty much golems. And so it was like the safe, the easy, and it was pretty much the meta. I don't think you can really argue otherwise. There was also a little bit of treb in there on some maps, like trebs were available if you like, so there was a few Tenri treb strats, or like barge, like put your treb into a barge or something. But for the most part, it was golems. In Groove of War 5, first we saw trebs get hard banned everywhere, which is nice, I think, for the game, because you don't have to think about Nuru treb or like Tenri treb or the treb slowly making its way. I could talk about treb, but that's not what I'm really here for. Groove of War 5. I think Groove of War 5 was all about abusing grooves as hard as you can. And there's a few reasons for that. The first reason is that there were a few OP commanders that, were still available. Caesar, Koji, and Ragna were still available, and they were still wrecking everything. Basically, the econ got lowered, and mountains in the middle got removed. There was also more like negative terrain, like roads, bridges, beaches, and rivers that were mostly around the center, but not just the center. And so it was basically harder to like golem abuse. There was still like golems were still present, but the most dominant strats during Groove of War 5 was to just farm as much groove as you can, and then since like the very strong grooves could like win the game instantly most of the time, it was really a groove race. Most maps tended to have a few villages that the commanders could like decap for free during the openings, and there was like some counter meta strats that like came around where like basically you would not capture villages so that the enemy couldn't farm grooves onto them. I think you would forfeit like around 800 gold in the opening so that the opponent doesn't like get like 2 kills on a village, and that's just crazy to think about nowadays. Like 800 gold is so much early on. But yeah, basically don't let the opponent farm groove. Farm groove yourself, and once you get groove, win the game with it. The HQs were still fairly safe, basically, but like fairly safe isn't really enough to stop yourself from dying to a Ragna or a Koji. I think the game pace wasn't the fastest at the time because people were mostly focused on farming groove, which meant that armies tended to mass quite easily. And that also meant that the strong grooves, which were the slow grooves at the time, were also way stronger because by the time the armies get online, you have groove and you can use it. And I think that was it for Groove of War 5. And then Groove of War 6 happened, and Groove of War 6 also banned Ragna and Koji, and now we had to learn a new way to play the game, and that's where Shu comes in. Shu just started spamming knights, and it worked. It worked really well. Because the OP grooves are gone, you have to find another way to win the game, and knights are pretty much the way. Knights allow you to be aggressive. They cap villages. There's not that many things that can actually trade against knights that are lower cost. Spears were still very much a memory of 1.3 for most players. And so knights were pretty much dominant. And the thing with knights is that once you've got the lead, it's quite easy to snowball a knight lead into a win, because a knight lead basically means the opponent has less control of the map, which means you can still harass villages and you can safely transition into a golem army, which your opponent won't be able to respond to because he doesn't have the money. And that's basically what the Groove of War 6 style was. Basically, everyone playing aggro, and the one who gets the lead tends to win the game. For Groove of War 7, things changed a bit. Not that much, but I think from here on, it's more the meta changes are more subtle. But Groove of War 7 had a more mid-game focus, I'd say. There's a few reasons I think that. Basically, first, Shu also figured that since the OP commanders are gone, you can actually disrupt their openings to like heavily delay them and gain an eco lead that way. That basically meant that there was less money in general early on, which I think delays the knights a little bit, which opens up more units to be on the field. There was also different maps that favored spears a bit more, and maps had started to nerf knights with terrain, which meant that while knights were still very relevant, they weren't like as central as before, and so we saw more mid-game armies. I think Groove War 7 was when you saw the most archers, which is pretty telling because archers need like a certain density of units to be on the field before they can be useful. I think another difference that was pretty relevant for Groove War 7 is that people started actually targeting the commander early game. The quick version is basically you have two knights and you try to kill or like prevent the commander from being active with these knights, and the commander alone usually won't be able to face these two knights. And that was pretty much Groove War 7. I think Groove War 7 had more mid-game army comps. I think the meta was to like harass the CO early on, and that's why we started to see like prep becoming more important from Groove War 7 on. And that brings me to the most recent one, Groove of War 8. And I think we saw way more dragon in Groove of War 8. And this might be a small change compared to Groove of War 7 because most of the things I said in Groove of War 7 were still present. Like the CO harass early on, I'd say the mid-game army comps are less present in Groove of War 8 because Dragon became more of a thing. There's a few reasons Dragon became way more relevant. The first is that Heist was in the map pool, and Heist Dragon is king. That's a pretty easy reason. But the other thing is that Dragon is a way to beat knights while also staying aggressive, which is something that spears don't do. Spears beat knights, but you commit to being passive if you rely on spears. Dragon was basically the best of both worlds, but it's hard to use. And I think because Groove of War 8 reused maps, people knew them better, and it was easier to transition into like Dragon to have the right timing to build it. And so I think that contributed to dragons being as impactful as they were. There was also a few big maps like Ouroboros, where dragon is good because of the high movement. A strong point of dragon is hitting the entire map, and people also realized. Maybe they knew beforehand, but it really was impactful during Groove of War, more during Groove of War 8, where basically when you build a dragon and your opponent tries to build mages everywhere, they become really passive. So your dragon, even if he doesn't hit anything, gets you a lead. And I think that's just a strong play, I guess. Another benefit of dragon is that it's a good way to stop early rushes onto the HQ. It also allows you to rush the HQ, which is a good option to have. And yeah, I think Groove of War 8 was a little more nuanced, but I think Dragon was a good like evolution from the Groove of War 7 meta. And that's about it. Until more Groove at least.